Who could have imagined that a poor boy from a large family, barely making ends meet, with a con artist father, would one day become the first dollar billionaire and change the world? When Rockefeller first turned his attention to oil, it was considered a symbol of chaos. This market was full of wild price swings and a complete lack of understanding of how to manage such a powerful resource. On the oil fields, the frantic race for black gold often ended in ruin, or even suicide for people. It seemed that no stability could be found in this sector. But Rockefeller saw in this chaos an unbreakable connection to the future. He understood that whoever could bring order and tame the market would rule it. His company, Standard Oil, was the first to transform oil from a wild resource into the foundation of civilization, providing stable supplies and setting new quality standards. Rockefeller didn't just make money, he built an empire. He was called the wealthiest person of his time, but he considered himself more of a builder than a rich man. "Friendship is based on trust, and business on efficiency," he said, proving it with every step he took. In the 19th century, the world was searching for new sources of light. Whale oil, which had long been used as fuel for lamps, became scarce due to the mass hunting of whales. Kerosene emerged as a replacement, initially produced from coal and later from oil, as this method proved to be cheaper and simpler. Oil reserves were vast, processing costs were lower, and the fuel quality was higher. Thus, kerosene turned out to be cheaper and safer than whale oil, but posed a new question: how to extract oil? Oil extraction was extremely primitive and dangerous. Oil was scooped by hand or weight until it seeped out of the ground on its own. Drilling technologies were experimental. One well might yield a flow of crude, while another yielded an empty hole. Meanwhile, extraction was accompanied by explosions, fires, and collapses. Oil fields, such as those in Oil Creek, became symbols of risk. Financial collapses, tragic stories of investors, and suicides turned these places into tales of greed and misfortune. Nonetheless, oil attracted fortune seekers. The few who managed to navigate through the chaos of the early years laid the foundation for an industry that would change the course of history. One of the few who managed to harness the potential of oil was John Davison Rockefeller, now known as one of the richest people in history and the founder of the first monopoly, Standard Oil. But to achieve this incredible success, he went through a thorny path. John Davison Rockefeller was born into a large family where his parents embodied two opposite approaches to life. His mother, a strict Baptist, taught the children that hard work and frugality were the main virtues. His father, on the contrary, was a con artist and bigamist who rarely appeared at home but gave the children lessons on how money is made. These encounters, as John recalled, became a real school of life for him. "I watched my father cheat us out of a few cents and realized that these were lessons you didn't have to pay for." From a young age, John combined both approaches. He raised pigs for sale, as his mother taught, and lent money to neighbors at interest, following his father's example. This experience laid the foundation for his future business empire. At 16, John decided that a university education was too lengthy a path and chose a 3-month bookkeeping course. Within a few months, he secured a job as a bookkeeper at Hewitt and Tuttle, where he became acquainted with the basics of trade and speculation. He distinguished himself so much that he was offered a managerial position, albeit with a low salary. John refused, deciding it was time to start his own business. By the age of 20, Rockefeller had an impeccable reputation and connections in business circles. However, his first ventures were not related to oil extraction, which would later make him wealthy. To Rockefeller, oil seemed utterly dreadful and unreliable. Yes, like everyone else in America at the time, he knew of dozens of people who became fabulously rich thanks to the oil veins they discovered. But he also knew of the thousands who went bankrupt, and of the fact that in the Oil Creek area, a stream along which prospectors drilled their wells, bodies of suicide victims or those who had crossed someone else were found daily. In short, oil extraction seemed to Rockefeller to be a dangerous, excessively risky, and highly unreliable occupation. The anarchy prevailing among the extractors would continue to irritate him for many years. But there was another way to enter the big game: oil refining. It was here that he spotted the weak link in the entire chain of black gold transactions, a term first applied to oil by a Cleveland journalist in the early 1860s. It was the refining that gave the product incredible added value. The anarchy among the extractors, in Rockefeller's opinion, worked in favor of the refiners. There were too many extractors, eaten alive by mutual grievances, and they would never be able to agree on a fixed price for the raw materials, allowing one to exploit their conflicts. In short, all these thoughts quickly came together in Rockefeller's mind as a business plan, and that very day, he approached Maurice Clark, the senior partner of his firm. Clark was an Englishman who, like his future business partner Andrews, had come to America seeking work and had made a fortune in wholesale food trade. Without hesitation, the friends established a company called The Flats. This proved to be a far-sighted move. At that time, the Atlantic Railway reached Cleveland, a key event for the future oil empire. The era of rapid growth in the oil industry was just beginning. Small refineries sprouted along the railroads, like mushrooms after the rain. However, their capacities left much to be desired. John Rockefeller immediately realized that scaling up was the key to success. One of the main challenges was the production of barrels for transporting oil. At that time, oil was transported in standard barrels borrowed from the herring industry. Due to the shortage of barrels and the greed of coopers, the cost of one barrel reached up to $5. Rockefeller and Andrews solved this problem radically. They established their own production of oak barrels. Within just a year and a half, they were manufacturing barrels at a cost of 94 cents each, 5 times cheaper than the market price. Their barrels were painted blue, and this tradition was maintained across all of Rockefeller's enterprises, becoming a symbol of quality. Incidentally, the barrel standard that emerged at that time is still used in the oil industry today. However, not everything within the company was smooth. Maurice Clark, the main shareholder, considered the oil business merely a temporary side job and insisted that the primary focus should be on the food trade. Constant disagreements with partners led Clark to declare that he was ready to leave the business. To his surprise, Rockefeller calmly agreed. An auction was organized to resolve the conflict. The starting bid was only $500, but by the end of the bidding, Rockefeller offered $72,500 and Clark conceded. At the age of 26, John Rockefeller became the full owner of the company. He considered this moment the beginning of his independent commercial career. Rockefeller earned a reputation as an extremely calculated individual. His approach was based on detailed analytics and risk minimization. When Maurice Clark exited the business, John quickly resolved the problem of capital shortage. Banks were happy to lend him money, and his reputation attracted private investors. Simultaneously, John focused on exports. The kerosene produced by his refinery became an important export commodity. Thanks to the low cost of sea transport, American kerosene was half the price of Russian or Austro-Hungarian kerosene on European markets. In 1866, Henry Flagler joined the company, a man whose ideas helped Rockefeller implement the concept of industry monopolization. One of the key steps was securing exclusive contracts with railroads. Flagler negotiated significant discounts on transportation by promising the carriers growing volumes of oil. These agreements became a tool to pressure competitors. Those who refused to sell their refineries were effectively hooked on advantageous contracts, which were subsequently terminated. As a result, competitors found themselves in debt and were forced to sell their enterprises. Rockefeller, being a man of principle, always offered former owners not only to buy out their debts, but also shares in his company. Many of them eventually became shareholders of Standard Oil and earned substantial money. In 1870, the company Rockefeller and Andrews was transformed into Standard Oil. The word standard was meant to emphasize the consistently high quality of the product, which, at that time, was an important distinction. Not all petroleum products were reliably produced. The capital of the new company was $1 million, making it the largest existing company on the planet at that time. Standard Oil became the first joint stock company in the industry, a very convenient form for attracting external capital. 10,000 shares, valued at $100 each, were distributed not only among the founders of the company, Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler, but also among several bankers from New York. By the time the company was established, the shareholders were far from newcomers in the oil business. The creation of their own company was preceded by the development of a detailed and well-thought-out plan. It was Rockefeller's plan that opened the investors' wallets. The main feature of the plan was the new company structure. The issue was that, according to the laws of that time, no firm could own property outside the state of its registration. This hindered business growth. Essentially, all existing firms at the time were small local enterprises, and the recently established Standard Oil stood out mainly in its form, being a joint stock company, and in the size of its capital. The new company had quite large capacities and enormous opportunities. The barrel manufacturing plant, which Rockefeller and Andrews had once struggled to launch, became the largest cooperative in the country. However, the barrels were imperfect. Besides the common issues with any returnable packaging, you transport a load one way and air back, the barrels deteriorated. Leaky containers caused product losses, which the industry considered standard shipping losses. Additionally, the barrels were heavy, weighing 1/5 of the cargo's weight. Therefore, as soon as tanks appeared, Rockefeller's company was among the first purchasers. By 1867, it had the largest private tank car fleet. Moreover, a private river fleet was used for transporting petroleum products, in which Rockefeller also outpaced his competitors. In fact, there were no minor details for the company. For example, the Cleveland Company employed 20 teamsters who transported barrels on wagons. It might seem small, but this detail became an ace for Rockefeller when retail transport prices suddenly soared, and he always had an operational reserve ready. It was also important that, thanks largely to Andrews' talents, the production of petroleum products was diversified and became almost waste-free. Yes, the main focus was on kerosene, whose consumption was growing exponentially and spreading to new markets. Following the old and new worlds, kerosene lamps successfully established themselves in Asia, Latin America, and even Africa, constantly demanding more and more fuel, kerosene. However, the partners also recognized another modern need, quickly becoming major players in it: lubricating oils. The world was indeed rapidly becoming a world of machinery, with the number of machines growing incredibly quickly and finding a place in every sphere of human activity. The kerosene yield was usually around 60%, but thanks to Rockefeller's attention to detail, ensuring no drop of kerosene was wasted, and Andrews' talents, Standard Oil's yield approached 70%. What many companies considered waste, Standard Oil turned into new products, actively creating markets for them. This included not only lubricating oils, which the partners quickly found a market for due to their special relationships with railroad magnates. Paraffin was also produced, and amusingly, it was often used to make candles, a competitor to kerosene lamps. Someone else's determination to produce paraffin and supply candle factories might be shaken, but not John Rockefeller's. He was confident that kerosene would prevail, and there should be no waste in its production. Everything that could be sold should be sold. In addition, Rockefeller and Flagler used all their influence and connections to push for a new road paving material: asphalt. Even in its earliest years, Standard Oil gladly cooperated with pharmacies and druggists, whose orders were tiny. They bought literally a few gallons of oil or oil products to prepare medicines or conduct experiments. However, Standard Oil embraced even small-scale retail, considering it an asset in developing its distribution network to reach the end consumer. Looking ahead, it seems Standard Oil hardly noticed the moment when Edison's electric bulb surpassed the kerosene lamp and gasoline engines had yet to conquer the world. The production of lubricating oils, asphalt, tar, ligroin, paraffin, and petroleum jelly supported the company through the transition from kerosene to gasoline production. In short, Standard Oil became not only the largest, most cunning and shrewd company, but also the most innovative, modern, and economical one, striving to anticipate everything possible many steps ahead. This was entirely in line with the character and business approach of the company leader, John Rockefeller. The questionable methods the partners used to bring the industry under their control, of course, remained in their arsenal. Moreover, Rockefeller became the secret owner of the Union Tank Car Railroad Company. The campaigns to bankrupt competitors, initiated by Flagler, not only continued but gained new momentum, as Union Tank Car also had a patent for tanker production. Figuratively speaking, Rockefeller's grip on his competitors' throats tightened even more. Rockefeller's office employed an entire spy network, constantly reporting on competitors' affairs. Many of these competitors, who were forced to transfer their property to the new owners at Standard Oil, later said that Rockefeller's accounting system was so meticulous that he knew about every nut, bucket, and rag in his enterprise, just as he knew more about the acquired businesses than their former owners. This meticulousness, elevated to an absolute and seemingly obsessive level, allowed for very efficient resource management and instant responses to any challenges, always having the means for an adequate reaction. Meanwhile, challenges came one after another. Already in 1869, the industry experienced a massive shock due to the oversupply of oil wells. This oversupply led to the emergence of many hastily constructed refineries that produced low-quality products, which manufacturers tried to sell at prices far below the market rates. It was clear that Rockefeller and his associates did everything to make such companies disappear from the scene quickly, and at that moment, they had enough resources to do so. By crushing small producers of low-quality kerosene, Rockefeller absorbed the volumes of raw materials they formerly processed. During this time, the company began an active export policy, led by John's brother, William Rockefeller. Blue barrels of oil became a common sight in European ports. The railroad tariff war was not over. Railroad magnates like Gould and Vanderbilt, in their fight for volume, were willing to radically lower oil transportation tariffs. And once again, Flagler stepped onto the stage. He offered the railroads daily shipments of petroleum products, proposing enormous volumes of transport, and promising to handle the loading and unloading himself. This last offer looked appealing but was essentially inevitable. Standard Oil's refineries were equipped with pumps for loading and unloading tankers, and the railroads were unwilling to spend money on expensive equipment. By dispatching specialized tanker trains instead of sending them on combined trains, the railroads saved on rolling stock, and the savings on rigging work and the rejection of pumps were an attractive and significant bonus. A railroad director, Devereux, later said that their savings on delivery amounted to $600,000 for each 20-day cycle. Naturally, for this generous offer, Flagler demanded a significant discount on the tariff, and, of course, given the aforementioned figures, he received it immediately. Standard Oil was once again at the top. However, to fulfill its obligations to the railroads, it lacked its own volumes, but Rockefeller knew how to consolidate competitors' volumes, to his great advantage, not only profiting from this, but also eliminating competitors. On one hand, like a forest caretaker, he cleared the industry of weak and poor quality producers. and on the other, he took over the best enterprises in the industry. The mechanics of subjugating and capturing competitor enterprises were well honed, and although they might seem primitively simple, competitors repeatedly fell into this trap. Setting and springing these traps was personally managed by Flagler, who, unlike the cold, seemingly detached and unlikable Rockefeller, knew how to get under one's skin and pretend to be a genial, friendly guy. Flagler would target a victim and have a confidential conversation with them, saying that they had excellent shipping discounts but couldn't fulfill their high quotas alone. They needed more kerosene to maintain the discount and offered the victim the opportunity to use their discount, provided that the victim supplied a certain volume. Flagler would cunningly name a figure that exceeded the current output of the competitor's oil refinery. The offer wasn't just enticing, it was fantastic. And the victim would take on credit to increase production, purchase large volumes of oil for kerosene processing, and then Flagler would reappear and say the deal was off. For the victim, who had invested in expanding production and purchasing raw materials, this meant immediate bankruptcy, and Flagler would rescue his recent friend by offering quite decent money for their business, considering the circumstances. Standard Oil did not stand on ceremony with enterprises that produced shoddy work. These factories were dismantled, but respectable firms remained and became part of Rockefeller's empire. Moreover, the owners found places within the structure of Standard Oil and later recalled that they earned far more with the company than during their period of independence. In 1871, when the industry's condition was frankly poor and many extraction, processing, and transport businesses were going bankrupt, Standard Oil paid its shareholders record dividends. Meanwhile, threats to its prosperity constantly arose, one of which was the new pipeline transport that could undermine Standard Oil's de facto monopoly on transporting oil products by rail. And that's exactly what happened. In 1874, the United Pipeline Association effectively broke Standard Oil's blockade and was promptly purchased by Rockefeller at a good discount. Of course, the history of pipeline transport deserves much more than a brief mention, but it should be noted here that the pipeline network not only increased the profitability of Standard Oil, but also became an important leverage point in negotiating tariffs with the railroads. In 1872, Rockefeller and Flagler undertook a rather risky project to unify transporters into a holding and refiners into a single association. This was done under the banner of fighting for reasonable and uniform transportation tariffs and setting adequate retail prices. In effect, it was a cartel agreement. As is well known, in such arrangements, some conspirators win more than others, and there are always losers. There were plenty of losers. That year, Standard Oil acquired 23 companies, and newspapers called this the Cleveland Massacre. The monopoly position nearly played a cruel joke on Rockefeller and Standard Oil, who might have been dizzy with success. They proposed to the railroads the idea of compensation, which meant that the railroads would compensate their discounts given to Standard Oil at the expense of small oil producers, for whom they would introduce surcharges, and these surcharges would be shared. For the first time, the producers, an anarchic bunch, united to form an oil production association. Their decisions were simple: reduce well output, cease drilling new wells, and refuse to cooperate with several refiners, including, and especially, Standard Oil. Violators could face severe reprimands or worse. Those in the oil fields were plain folks with rough manners, not much for explaining things, and bodies in the Oil Creek area were commonplace. So the mood among producers was quite serious. Effectively, a monopoly of producers emerged in response to the monopoly of transporters and refiners. The sides took extremely uncompromising positions, everyone incurred losses, and the question was just who would hold out longer. But the answer to this question was known: large corporations would hold out longer, and there was no corporation larger than Standard Oil in the industry. Clearly, the well owners were experiencing losses, and eventually, a daring individual emerged who sold 20,000 barrels to Rockefeller. Acknowledging that this wouldn't remain a secret, this respected person, a hero of the recent war, explained his decision by saying that the strike was foolish from the start and more of a losing proposition than a winning one. Many others quickly followed his example. The Oil Producers Alliance collapsed, and as always, Standard Oil emerged from the crisis in a better state than all others, increasing its lead over competitors and absorbing those who couldn't withstand the storm. This instantly changed the producers' attitude toward Rockefeller. From now on, he was the undisputed leader of the industry, a person everyone listened to and whom the entire market trusted. This reputation would soon allow Rockefeller to acquire the largest enterprises in the Oil Creek Valley. Negotiations with him were now welcomed. That's how Standard Oil, which once avoided oil production, began acquiring wells, first in Pennsylvania, then in Ohio, California, and beyond. Quietly, Rockefeller incorporated the refineries of his old acquaintances, the Clark brothers, his former partners whom he could barely stand when dealing with oil before the creation of Standard Oil. At that time, their company was called Clark and Payne, and Rockefeller managed to strike a deal with Payne, an unfamiliar young aristocrat, Yale and Princeton graduate, colonel and socialite, transferring control of the enterprise to Standard Oil, with Payne representing its interests on the board of directors. In the challenging year of 1872 for the industry, Standard Oil became the undisputed leader of the oil market. Its share in oil refining reached 34%. Competitors were nowhere in sight, but as it turned out, this was just the beginning, merely a starting leap. From this point, Standard Oil began acquiring companies across America, not only those involved in oil refining, but also distributors, quickly forming its own retail network. These companies retained their names and management, but not their ownership. They entirely belonged to Standard Oil, carried out no unauthorized policies, and were fully managed by headquarters under the leadership of Flagler. In short, a monopolistic octopus was created, which was completely invisible to the general public. The companies appeared independent, and the deals to acquire companies or controlling stakes in them were not public. In the mid-1870s, the U.S. market was experiencing difficult times, providing even more motivation for expansion into foreign markets. Rockefeller and Flagler engaged with the most influential government officials, convincing them that exporting kerosene to other countries was extremely beneficial for America. However, it might not have needed much convincing, but the undeniable fact was that from that time, every U.S. consul abroad essentially became a sort of sales agent for Standard Oil. Rockefeller and his associates openly compensated their work, allocating bonuses to consuls for each transaction, while the international business was overseen by William Rockefeller. An interesting detail: Standard Oil's shares were rising during one of the most severe crises known to America at that time. While many of the country's businesses were going bankrupt and closing, Standard Oil was paying dividends of $115 per share, which, it should be noted, had a nominal value of $100. By then, Rockefeller was leading the largest corporation in the world, and almost any of its nearly 70,000 employees could directly approach him with their proposals. They had reason to be confident that Rockefeller would read their letters and consider their ideas. It's unclear exactly how, given Rockefeller's workload as the company's leader and his attention to detail. But that's how it was. The letters were read and ideas were acted upon. Rockefeller's management style can be illustrated by this episode. Once, he observed how kerosene cans were being filled. The process was mechanized. Cans were brought to a hose on a cart, each filled with exactly 5 gallons of liquid. Then a lid was screwed on and sealed. Rockefeller inquired how many drops of solder were used for each lid, and when informed that it was 40 drops, he immediately suggested trying 38. It turned out that at 38 drops, some cans began to leak. They tried 39 drops and found there were no leaks. By the evening of that day, all the company's facilities received the directive to use 39 drops of solder per lid, a change that was implemented the very next day. This sounds like an anecdote, but it is a true story, and contemporaries recall many similar instances. Meanwhile, the corporation was expanding so rapidly that Rockefeller, who loved keeping records and wanted to control almost everything, including paperclip usage in his business, feared losing control over such a vast enterprise. As a result, toward the end of 1879, the process of organizing all corporation entities into a trust began. It was the first such experience in the world. Later, it would be dissected, analyzed, and even defined as a trust, which meant a monopoly association where the participants lose their production, commercial, and legal independence, and follow the directives of the main company, the actual owner of the enterprise. However, it's not certain that Rockefeller and Flagler articulated this concept so clearly for themselves, though it's indisputable that they were creating a behemoth with precisely these characteristics. A board of trustees composed of 3 individuals was formed within Standard Oil, to whom other shareholders entrusted their stocks and the power to make decisions regarding all companies. This trio committed to managing the assets exclusively in the interests of the 37 individual shareholders of Standard Oil, not in the interests of Standard Oil as a corporation. Later, when antitrust proceedings related to Standard Oil began, the trust's lawyers would use this to justify the arrangement. Yes, the interests of the individuals coincided, and the fact that all these individuals happened to be Standard Oil shareholders was purely coincidental. In 1882, the prolonged crisis in the United States transitioned into a period of rapid growth. Moreover, the favorable conditions of both the domestic and global markets would provide Standard Oil with clear skies and prosperity for the following 11 years. During this time, the company's capitalization increased by 7 to 10% annually, but the shareholders' incomes grew even faster, almost 5-fold over 11 years. In the 1890s, Standard Oil began expanding into China, where kerosene was sold under the brand Meifu. The leaders believed that a market of 400 million people could not be ignored. This push was motivated by the construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway and a statement by Russian Premier Witte, who dreamed of seeing tank cars filled with kerosene from the Nobel brothers traveling along the railway. Notably, the tank cars did travel, and the battle between the two giants, who until then had not confronted each other directly, ended in favor of the Americans. Thanks to the senseless Russo-Japanese War, which spoiled Russia's relations with the Eastern market for a long time, the Americans made a clever move in capturing the Chinese market. As the Nobel brothers had once done in Russia, they distributed or sold kerosene lamps to the Chinese for free, or at a symbolic price, with the lamps also being called Meifu. And these were enthusiastically received by the population. China, which had previously used only vegetable oil for lighting, quickly and willingly switched to kerosene. Large oil storage facilities and packaging plants for filling petroleum products into blue tin cans for retail sale were built in China's major ports. A large ocean and river tanker fleet was rapidly constructed to supply China with products. The operation to capture the Chinese market was conducted exemplary. Adding to the innovations, as we have mentioned earlier, Rockefeller, who once despised oil producers, spent his entire life striving for perfect order. In his view, the numerous oil producers epitomized chaos. At some point, he realized that owning his own oil wells would make his business more resilient, and so Standard Oil entered the oil extraction business, acting in their distinctive manner, cautiously, yet decisively. By this time, Samuel Andrews was no longer with the company. He was the first of the founders and ideologists to leave, having done so already in 1874. It is said that Andrews, who would later be known as a mechanical genius, was burdened by the aggression of Rockefeller and Flagler. Sensing this, Rockefeller at some point offered to buy Andrews' shares. Andrews received a substantial sum, but nothing more is known about his involvement in business thereafter. What is known is that he built an enormous palace in Cleveland. For some reason, he always expected that Queen Victoria would visit him and prepared for such a meeting. It is unlikely that the Queen knew anything about this. At least, her visit to Cleveland never occurred, and there is no record of her plans to visit America or meet Mr. Andrews. The palace, which astonished visitors with its impracticality and inability to be used for any purpose, outlived Andrews and was only demolished in the 1920s. By the mid-1880s, Henry Flagler also began to gradually step back from business. His frequent visits to Florida began around this time, as doctors believed the peninsula's climate would benefit his ailing wife. Although he remained on the board of directors at Standard Oil, Flagler increasingly focused on Florida endeavors, building hotels and a railroad, leading many to consider him the pioneer of Florida as a resort destination. In 1882, John Archbold took over Flagler's role in the affairs of Standard Oil. Archbold climbed all the rungs of the career ladder, starting in 1864 with oil production in Oil Creek, and initially being one of Rockefeller's loudest and harshest critics. However, people change, and it's simplistic to see Archbold's transition to the camp of his former adversary as merely an opportunistic move. He undoubtedly understood, embraced, and genuinely shared all of Rockefeller's ideas about harmony and entropy. Although a person of remarkable abilities, Archbold inadvertently became a witness to and participant in all of Standard Oil's setbacks, beginning with the very first task Rockefeller assigned to him, countering the work of a government commission aimed at regulating railroad tariffs. Unfortunately, the tariffs were equalized, hidden fees and discounts were eliminated, and Archbold lost the case against the government and the people of the United States, as stated in the commission's decision. However, to be fair, could he have realistically won? This outcome did not affect his career in any way. Rockefeller and Flagler were more sympathetic than critical of him. Overall, things were going exceptionally well for Rockefeller's trust. At one point, Standard Oil produced over 90% of petroleum products in the US and about 75% worldwide. Rockefeller was the richest person on the planet, and those who dared to align their lives, fates, and businesses with him and Standard Oil appeared to be exceptionally fortunate. However, in 1890, thanks to efforts by Senator Sherman, the Sherman Act was passed, becoming the first antitrust law in history. According to its provisions, monopolies would be accused of obstructing trade. Although this term was defined very vaguely, it would not help those who would later fall victim to its enforcement. Nonetheless, almost certainly, neither America nor Standard Oil paid much attention to this law at the time. It appeared cumbersome, and its enforcement seemed impractical. The start of the 20th century, during which the rapidly expanding Standard Oil, by then a global rather than just an American monopolist, roared ahead, brought the US a new president, young, talented, and ambitious Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt would become the one to dismantle Standard Oil. He made breaking up the world's largest monopolist one of his presidential goals, and ultimately, this goal was achieved. Although only after Roosevelt's term had ended